So that was an excellent couple of overview papers to set the stage. We're now going to delve into a series of talks that highlight some of the papers in this special issue with respect to the effects of these treatments on the species of interest. Our next speaker is Dr. Peter Coates. He's at the USGS Western Ecological Research Center at Dixon Field Station, Dixon, California. Peter is a research wildlife biologist for the U.S. Geological Survey. Peter?
All right, thank you, Christian. Okay, well, I'm pleased to be here today to talk about some of our findings from some work that we've conducted in the bi-state for just about 10 years of data here. And we're going to get a little bit more in detail on how conifer encroachment or conifers on the landscape influence local distribution of grouse, basically their space use patterns, and then what this means for survival, the decisions they make on the landscape. Does that pay off, essentially? The next talk, we'll follow up this one with some of the mechanisms that describe these patterns. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors here as well. This was really a team effort, and everybody contributed substantially to this research. So earlier today, we've heard lots of talks about range expansion, conifers across the West, and contraction, largely driven by climate, CO2, grazing, wildfire, and so forth. Some really good talks on that. We know this is occurring. This seems very typical. This is a slide that's been around for quite some time. Rick added some publication. And this is occurring quite a bit in a lot of sage grouse range. What we haven't talked about, and what the next few talks will start to focus on, is what does this mean for wildlife populations, especially sagebrush obligate species like sage grouse. And if they are an indicator for what's happening with other obligate species, then these types of results would pertain. So this is a typical landscape sage grouse environment here, where at lower elevations we have lek sites, and around those leks, within around approximately 5 kilometers, the majority of nests take place. And sometimes those nests are up in a little higher elevation in the foothills. But we really have this annual cycle that the grouse experiences where it moves from one location to another to meet those seasonal requirements that the habitat needs within these areas. And oftentimes they have these barriers, such as this band of conifers that runs at this mid-elevation that separates the mountain shrub and mountain sagebrush zone at high elevation, which is associated with these upland wet meadows that they're trying to access in their brood rearing stage. And even outside of the brood rearing stage, the late summer habitat, all these birds are trying to get up into these upland wet meadows. And they have to negotiate this band of conifers going from these lower elevations. And then in the wintertime, they start to move back down, using sometimes a different area from the lek sites, but higher, taller sagebrush areas, and then back to the breeding areas. So this is what the grouse faces on the landscape. With increasing in both upper and lower elevation expansion of conifer, what does this mean for sage grouse in how they behave across the landscape and survival? So we took this population of grouse, the bi-state population on the border of California and Nevada, which probably has the most amount of conifer expansion and the most amount of range contraction for sage grouse, down to approximately 25% of their historic range. It's a geographically isolated area, genetically distinct population of grouse. And like I mentioned, we have approximately 10 years of data, VHF and GPS data, but with high resolution sage grouse data, we needed high resolution conifer data. So at this point in time, there was no product available other than those derived from Landsat imagery, which is at 30-meter resolution, little too coarse scale for the type of work that we were conducting here. So we carried out a remote sensing type of procedure. You might have heard the wavelet analysis talk yesterday. This is a similar type of procedure. It's image recognition software called Feature Analyst. It does something a bit different, in which it looks at essentially the pixel value as well as the shape of the object. 1 meter resolution, uses NAPE imagery, and is fairly accurate. And we conducted this across the entire bi-state, and now have expanded across Nevada and California with this procedure. So we have 1 meter resolution data on PJ, so you could see from this image looking down, we're capturing nearly every tree on the landscape. And it does a good job when under low canopy cover of capturing those single trees out there, and it does also a really good job under high canopy cover of capturing that. It doesn't quite fall apart when the trees are dense. But what we're really interested in from here is understanding how these different sporadic trees versus dense trees influence sage-grouse movement and survival. So we don't have on-the-ground information across the entire bi-state. We're bringing this into a GIS. So we're corresponding the phases of encroachment, these transitional phases that folks have talked about earlier, into these cover classes. And we assign a percent cover, canopy cover, to a phase. For example, cover class above 0 to 10 would be analogous to phase 1. We're not incorporating the understory vegetation, so it really is just based on tree canopy cover. But we have cover class 1, 2, and 3 that we're really interested in. So here you could see the single trees are captured there, resampled up to the 30-meter resolution. Those are all canopy cover 1 up to 10%, and then the blue canopy cover 2, which would be similar to phase 2, and then 3 is where it's really dense. It does a really good job at kind of picking up these low tree cover areas, which is important for this analysis. So like I mentioned, we did this for the bi-state, and now in entire Nevada. You're going to see that in the next talk. With high-resolution conifer data, we need high-resolution sage-grouse data for some of the objectives we're trying to accomplish here. So we had over 10,000 points for this particular study, many of which were GPS telemetry, 14 locations a day, 1 hour per location, or 1 hour increment between locations, and then some VHF data as well that go back quite a few years. So what we're going to do is fly from the northern end of the pine nuts down south. The canopy cover classes are in green. The actual light green is the most dense, and then the dark green is actually canopy cover class 2, and the one that's most dominant across the landscape is low cover. And the purple points reflect both GPS and VHF data, and you'll just kind of look at where these grouse use the landscape as we fly south here. If we could get the image to play. It always runs in the practice run, but for some reason. Well, I might have to move on. Yeah, this is actually a screen capture, but usually if you just hit it there, it goes. Well, I'm going to need to move on, but I'll kind of describe. As it flies south, the upland wet meadows, you could see a lot of the points up in these upland wet meadows where there's patches of sagebrush, but yet we still have birds using the cover class 1, and they move quite a bit quickly, infrequent locations through canopy cover class 2 and 3. You could kind of see that in the distance. So what we want to do is model this, try to understand not just bird avoidance of trees and tree influences on survival, but how the decisions birds are making, given information about that individual bird, influence their survival probability. So we carried out a Bayesian approach. It's this 2-stage modeling approach, where in the first stage, we have information per bird, and we're modeling essentially their avoidance coefficient. And because it's Bayesian, we have the entire posterior distribution. So we have the uncertainty associated with that for every bird. A second stage that ran parallel, as it churned out those estimates, it brought it into another model as a predictor variable for survival. So in other words, what we're trying to capture is the decision that the bird is making to avoid PJ, whether it be in cover class 1, 2, or 3, we model them all separately, influencing their survival probabilities. And then in a post hoc analysis, we actually looked at what other factors related to these cover classes might influence survival, such as productivity of the landscape, which gets to this ecological trap idea that Rick brought up. So this isn't your typical figure here, so I'm going to explain it. Basically, on the x-axis, we have the proportion of Pinyon Juniper, and on the y-axis is the log odds of avoidance or selection. And it's kind of flipped, but how to read this is those lines that are moving upward in an upward direction in red, those have evidence for selection. The greater the slope, the more, or I'm sorry, for avoidance. The greater the slope, the more likely they are to avoid that environment. And those that are blue, it's greater evidence for either proportionate use or selection. What we'll notice here is where the log odds is 0, which is really a probability of selection of 50%, is right about 30% of cover class 1. Now, because cover class 1 is greater than 0 to 10% tree canopy cover, when you calculate that back to actual canopy cover, it's 1.5% of actual trees on the landscape within that area that sage grouse exists. So this serves as somewhat of a threshold. The black line represents the population level mean or estimate. And what this means is above that 1.5% actual tree canopy cover, there's more evidence of avoidance. However, that means that more individuals are avoiding those trees, but the population level is pretty flat. So some birds are deciding not to avoid, and other birds are deciding to avoid those areas. Now, this isn't the case for cover class 2 and 3. There's very strong evidence of avoidance for nearly every bird. And I want to point out that each one of those lines represents an individual bird, and we had a full posterior distribution for that bird, meaning hundreds of samples, and this is just the median value from that posterior for every one of those lines. So you could see the majority of the population avoided cover class 2 and 3, or disproportionate use to availability. So now in the second stage of this, it ran parallel. We were linking that avoidance pattern to survival. And the way this essentially works is as it's churning out the estimates from the left side here, and that's at the individual level, we're estimating the population level effect on survival. So in other words, the coefficients are used, or the log odds are used as a predictor variable for survival on the right side. And as you can see, there's very strong evidence on the x-axis, the relative probability of avoidance. As it increases, the probability of survival increases. Now that's also the posterior distribution for that effect there, meaning that because none of them are crossing the dash line, there's very strong evidence for this. So those birds that made the decision not to move through cover class 1 or stay in sagebrush were far more likely to survive. And when you compare it to the highest level avoidance, it's about a 20% difference in survival. So an interpretation of the parameter estimate is a 10% increase in the probability of avoiding cover class 1 was associated with an increased survival probability of about 2%. Now, we didn't find this to be the case for cover class 2 and 3, and it's largely because these birds are avoiding that environment, so there's not much opportunity for them to live or die in that environment. But we also have a mechanistic explanation for this as well that'll make sense when we get to the post-hoc analysis, and that the predator community between these dense tree environments might be different than the sporadic tree environments and mimic more like the dense sagebrush environments, and that there's fewer hawks in dense trees and sagebrush, but sporadic trees there's more large raptors. So the post-hoc analysis, we wanted to investigate this further. We've seen a figure similar to this earlier and have addressed these concepts of resilience and resistance, which along this ecological gradient at lower elevation, which I showed in that one graphic where sage grouse really start the breeding cycle there. These are warm, dry environments as you move up in elevation, more productivity and fuels. We're in this big sagebrush mountain shrub zone, and we have conifers between. Does that effect on survival vary across this ecological gradient? And as it turns out, the blue represents the high productivity or high R&R, and the red represents the low productivity. And when there's no trees, a proportional cover class at 0, it pays to be in the high productive area, probably more understory vegetation. Now those effects are nullified at the same threshold that we saw from the avoidance, which is about 30% cover class 1, corresponding to 1.52% canopy cover. Beyond that, even in these high productive environments, their survival probabilities are decreasing. And we think this is because these areas, these high productive areas where you have upland wet meadows, are in fact ecological traps. They're offering environmental cues to be there, but because there's trees surrounding these areas which are perching and nesting substrate for large hawks, there's a survival consequence to making a decision to be at that particular site. So we've been able to map some of these areas throughout the bi-state and also beyond where these ecological traps occur. That's the red there. If you overlay, for example, the low tree density with the high R&R, and then also bring in the sage grouse information like resource selection functions and space use models to define these core areas, you could get at perhaps some areas where you might benefit grouse the most if you treat trees in those areas. And Mark's going to talk about, once those areas are defined, how to prioritize them. The last point I want to make is the larger pattern here that we've seen from previous research, Brock-Murdo's papers, is that this 2% threshold exists there too on lek inactivity. In other words, as the percent conifer cover hits 2%, and that's actual tree cover, you're at about 50% probability of a lek being inactive. Beyond that, there's evidence that it's going to be inactive. When you get out to this 4 and 5%, you're pretty much, especially if they have Lee effects in these populations, you're pretty much going to go, that lek will go extinct or inactive. And our thresholds are matching something very similar to that lek population dynamic, in which we're finding the avoidance at that same 1.52%, the 50% probability of avoidance. And then also this threshold where the signal occurred where we have this influence on survival at the same threshold. So what we're suggesting here is that this is the process that really helps define that pattern that was previously published by Brock-Murdo et al. We also think there's other, of course, and we're going to hear about other life stages that are impacted by trees. This is just survival. But when you look out to 80% canopy cover, which is a 4% actual cover of trees, we're looking at about 10% survival below the mean. And for a grouse, that means a lot when it relates back to population viability. 10% is quite a drop. Even with really high chick survival and really high nest survival, with that reduction in adult survival, the population is likely to be declining. And we're looking into that right now. So the take-home points here is that there is variation in this behavior under low canopy cover, not high canopy cover, but under low canopy cover on whether or not to avoid. Those that are avoiding are more likely to survive. So we've been able to kind of tease that apart. And our model supports this threshold of definitely a 4%. We're actually indicating that the true threshold is around 1.5%, where you're gaining more evidence for lek inactivity, probability of avoidance, and reduction in survival when you're above 2% canopy cover. The last point I want to make is there's a lot of talk and research out there as far as fuels management on thinning some of these dense areas, cover class 2 and 3 in our case, but leaving some trees standing. And the real problem theoretically here with this, given our results, is that we're really providing a cover class 1 environment, especially if there's high productivity in that area. We might be drawing grouse into that area. Raptors are using those areas, and grouse would otherwise be avoiding them if they were high tree canopy cover, but we might actually be influencing population viability, at least survival, if we do that. So it might do more harm than good. So removing all the trees would be probably a better thing for grouse given these results. With that, I'd like to acknowledge the many folks that have collected the data, been involved in the research, and funded it, mostly funded from BLM and SGI. And I want to thank all the support for these results and projects. Thank you.